We need to talk about Lebanon as the highest level ministerial delegation paid a visit to Syria a few days ago. And this is the first visit since 2011, which means after the eruption of the war on Syria. The reason for that is Lebanon is highly divided on political and sectarian lines, and the bloc that is allied with the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the rest, of course, they're not going to visit Syria, and they supported the so-called rebels in Syria. And the other bloc that is allied with Syria, especially Hezbollah was paying, of course, visits, but it's not official visits. And the Free Patriotic Movement, which is led by Gibran Bassil, they were more or less threatened by the United States that they will be sanctioned if they go to Syria or they open channels to Syria, etc. So the visits or the communication between Syria and Lebanon was more or less under the table, and especially on a security level. But before we address this, let's go back, not a little bit this time, but let's dive in a little bit in history to understand why Lebanon is a special case, and why when Syria sneezes, Lebanon gets cold. And after 2011, it appears that when Lebanon sneezes, Syria also gets cold. So when the First World War was over, the colonialists, and namely France and Britain, they came and they divided the Middle East into different regions of influence. And they specified Syria and Lebanon and said it will be under the mandate of France. Now, historically, Lebanon is part of Syria, but the idea of France of creating a Lebanon was to serve two purposes. One, it's a divide and conquer strategy that the colonialists, of course, pursued in the Middle East. And the second is to establish a Christian state neighboring a Jewish state, which is Israel. And they thought that if there would be a Christian state, it would live in peace and harmony with the Israeli created country or state, which proved after 100 years that it didn't succeed for Britain and for France. Now, Lebanon stayed under the occupation that they called mandate between 1916 and 1946. And 1946, Syria and Lebanon, they gained their independence together, but each became like separate independent countries. Now, during this time, they were also, after the Second World War and the mandate was over, the independence gained by Lebanon, there were turmoils similar to Syria, coup d'etats, foreign interventions, etc. But the biggest shift in the history of the modern Lebanon was in 1975, when a very brutal civil war erupted in Lebanon. And this civil war was also on sectarian, religious, and political lines. It was, seriously, in the region, this was the most brutal war, and the Christians, for the first time, they established militias and they committed horrendous crimes, because for them, this was their state. This should be a Christian state, so they engaged in a war against the Muslims and especially against the Palestinians. And the two parties who were responsible for horrendous war crimes, ethnic cleansings, and genocide were the Lebanese forces, led by Jaja, and the Phalanges, headed by Gemayel family. Now, Syria didn't like the idea that its neighboring country has fallen into this kind of chaos and the civil war. And the Lebanese government asked the Syria to send troops into Lebanon in order to stop the civil war. Syria sent thousands of soldiers into Lebanon in order to stop the civil war, and it sent it in 1976. But instead of only stopping the civil war, Syria was also engaged in a war with different political parties in Lebanon. Unfortunately, Syria fought everyone in Lebanon and made alliances with everyone, and it depends on the stages of the civil war. And Syria had a strategic interest in keeping Lebanon stable, but at the same time it had a strategic interest in keeping Israel out of Lebanon, because Israel, during the civil war, which erupted in 76, I mentioned, and in the first 6 years, namely in 82, intervened in Lebanon because they exploited this, let's say, turmoil, and they occupied southern Lebanon in 82. And because of this occupation, and southern Lebanon was mostly, the residents were Shiites, Hezbollah was formed in 82 in response to the occupation of Israel. Of course, Hezbollah was not alone. The communists fought against Israel, Hezbollah fought against Israel, Amal movement, which is also another Shia movement, fought against Israel, and the Syrian nationalists, SSMP, also fought against Israel during this time. But because Hezbollah had more or less the supporting and the backing of Iran back then, it has become the mainstream armed group that was the most effective armed group, let's say, against the Israeli occupation. Now, this civil war in Lebanon has continued till 1989, and in 1989 Saudi Arabia brokered an agreement, of course with the blessing of Syria and other regional countries. It is called Taif agreement, and Taif agreement divided Lebanon into, or the powers in Lebanon, let's say the parliament should be from a Shia, which is now Nabi Berri. The prime ministry should be from a Sunni family, and the presidency should be a Christian Maronite. So they tried to give each of these fighting groups a piece of the cake. But in my opinion, this is the worst political system in the entire Middle East, if you ask me. And this agreement established an economy that is mostly based on the services. It's a services-based economy and mostly relies on tourism sector and services. And at the same time, the warlords who had enormous role during the civil war and had blood on their hands and everything, they became just the leaders of political parties, and none of them were persecuted or sent to jail, except for Samir Jaja, who stayed in jail, I believe, till 2005, and then he was released from jail after a special pardon by the president of Lebanon, Emil Lahoud. Now, in 89, the Taif agreement was signed, and there was a relative peace in Lebanon. In 2000, Hezbollah and other resistance groups in southern Lebanon, they managed to kick out the Israeli occupation forces from southern Lebanon, and they received an enormous support from Syria, and I'm talking about military support and political support in order to kick out Israel from Lebanon in 2000. So in 2000, Syria had at least 15,000 soldiers in Lebanon, and they had their air defense systems, etc., which engaged in war with Israel during the 80s in Lebanon. And Israelis withdrew, and Lebanon stayed, like, it became an area of influence for Lebanon, for Syria. So for me, it was like a Syrian mandate over Lebanon. And between 2000 and 2005, the Syrian forces remained there. In 2005, another very important event happened, which is the assassination of the former prime minister of Lebanon. Back then, he was the acting prime minister, Rafi al-Hariri. He was a very influential political figure. He was a very influential Sunni figure who gathered the Sunnis of Lebanon behind him. And this assassination resulted in a very huge political and military pressure on the Syrian government, The United States, France, Britain, name it, they all accused Syria of assassinating the prime minister. Syria denied it. They established a special tribunal in Hague and accused Syria formally of assassinating the prime minister. And now, after 15 to 16 years, the tribunal they closed the doors. They didn't find anything. They didn't formally accuse Syria. Syria wasn't accused of being the side who assassinated the prime minister. So it was a political moment back then to raise pressure on Syria to force the Syrian forces to leave Lebanon. This was a very important moment because, in my opinion, when Syria withdrew from Lebanon, it allowed this struggle of power over Lebanon to be transferred into Syria. And this is what we have seen in 2011. So when Syria was in Lebanon, all these conflicts in the region were happening in Lebanon. But when Syria withdrew to Syria, the territory of the fight also has been transferred from Lebanon into Syria, and the war on Syria in 2011 is the proof of that. In 2006, the Israeli occupation forces invaded Lebanon again in order to regain its previous momentum, its previous privileges in Lebanon, its previous status in Lebanon. But Hezbollah managed to kick out Israel again from Lebanon, and Hezbollah received all sorts of weaponry from Syria. And when Syrians withdrew from Lebanon in 2005, Syrian army left the most important weaponry and the stockpiles they have in the hands of Hezbollah for them to use later against Israel in 2006, and they managed to kick out Israel thanks to the Syrian weapon, and also, of course, thanks to the fighters who were underground. Now, in 2011, the Arab Spring erupted. Now, just before this, when the assassination of Hariri happened, Lebanon was divided into two political blocs, which is one, the 14th March, which is a pro-American and pro-Israeli bloc, and the 8th March, which is the pro-Syria, pro-Iran bloc in Syria. But in 2011, these two blocs were still there, but the United States had another idea, which is to pump up the civil society. And when I say the civil society, are the so-called neoliberals, the radical left wings, the people who were trained by the NGOs in order to create color revolution there. Now, why the United States did that, although they have a bloc which is called the 14th March Coalition, right? I will tell you later about that. Now, in 2017 and 2018, a so-called revolution erupted in Lebanon, and the people who were behind this so-called revolution were this civil society. And this civil society, they were very successful in paralyzing the country, paralyzing the economy, and there was a huge collapse in the Lebanese economy. And today in 2021, when the Lebanese lira was, every dollar was 1,500 Lebanese lira, today it's like 20,000 or something Lebanese lira. So there was a huge collapse. And the banks in Lebanon, they don't have any more cash. The people who put their money in the Lebanese banks, they can't get them. You can't. If you have, let's say, $100,000, you go to the bank tells you, okay, we give you 30% of your money cash and you forget about the rest, or we can't give you the money now, maybe in the future we have to get maybe like $1,000 per month from the bank, no more that. So it's a huge economic crisis happening in Lebanon. And why is that? Because the United States, they want to defeat Hezbollah and its bloc, right? And by pushing the country into such collapse, the two blocs, the 14th and the 8th March, who are in power right now, they will also collapse. But if the Americans can sacrifice their allies in the 14th March, at the same time, they are able to bring these civil society people into power, they don't care. The people who served them in the past 15 years, they can get rid of the people in the 14th March. As long as the alternative for these two blocs who are ruling the country is the civil society people, these NGO people who could come into power and serve the American interests again. And by doing so, they are trying to force Hezbollah to intervene in a domestic turmoil again and use the weapons they have against in an internal conflict, which Hezbollah doesn't want to do that. So they put Hezbollah in a very strange and bizarre situation that they don't want to use their weapons. At the same time, the economy is collapsing, and their own people, the Shia people, they're not able to secure fuel, they're not able to secure electricity, they're not able to secure bread. So of course there was an anger even among the Hezbollah people, right? So Hezbollah said, okay, if the Americans want to force us to intervene, we will intervene, but in a different way. We will go to Iran and we will bring fuel from Iran on our expense. We will distribute to the Lebanese people on our expense. And we will consider the shipments that are coming from Iran to Lebanon as Lebanese territory. And if Israel or United States attack our tankers, we will retaliate against them. This was a very also complicated moment for the United States. How can they react to such a step? So the United States, to block or to stop these shipments from Iran, or further shipments from Iran, they said, okay. You want to play this game? We will allow Lebanon to get gas from Egypt and electricity from Jordan. But to do that, this has to come through Syria, and they don't want to deal with Syria, but they have made compromise. They said, okay, no more tankers from Iran. We will allow Lebanon to get gas from Egypt and energy from Jordan. So they told the Lebanese ministerial delegation, okay, you go now to Syria and deal with the Syrian government, as long as no more tankers coming from Iran. So the highest ministerial delegation from Lebanon paid a visit to Syria, and they agreed with the Syrian counterpart to let this Egyptian gas pipeline to come from Egypt into Jordan and pass through Damascus and Homs, and from Homs to Tripoli, and then distribute into other areas in Lebanon. So this was the first American acceptance that its policy of isolation, sanctions, blockade, and all these policies have failed. Of course, they had huge repercussions, negative repercussions on the people underground, but the other players also, they were determined to turn the tides, right? They have to do something about their people and the people of the region. So, for the first time in the past 11 years, the United States gives a green light to a political bloc or political players and parties in Lebanon to go to Syria and ask for the permission of Syria to get the Egyptian gas through to Syria. And this is the first time the United States maneuvers or circumvents the Caesar Act and other sanctions imposed on Syria, which is, in my opinion, a positive signal. And it's not like they wanted to do this, they were forced to do this, but at least they did it. And now there are other signals coming from the United States, and this is not like an analysis, it's also information coming to some sources in Syria, which says the United States is willing to withdraw from Syria after its withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Washington has told its allies in the eastern shores of the Euphrates, namely the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces led by the Kurdish separatists, that they will withdraw from Syria. So these are positive, let's say, signals coming from Washington. Let's see how this will be translated on the ground, especially after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because in my opinion, this is the United States is trying to regroup for another conflicts, especially in Central Asia, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which will have, in my opinion, positive impact on Syria. In 2022 could be the year when the American forces withdraw from Syria, and I'm hopeful about it. And if the Americans withdraw, maybe 50% of the troubles and the daily problems that the Syrians encounter could be resolved finally. Now, In your opinion, do you think that the United States gave a green light, the policy of the United States of giving a green light to the Lebanese delegation to go to Syria and deal with Syria, with the Syrian government that these Americans are sanctioning, is the first step or the first signal of the Americans that they want to normalize relations with Syria again? And if they want to normalize their relations with Syria once again, are they going to accept President Bashar al-Assad as the legitimate leader of Syria? What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. I've been your host, Kevork Almasian of Syriana Analysis. Please guys, subscribe to my channel. It really helps me. Even if you think that you're subscribed, please check. And if you want to support Syriana Analysis financially, which really helps me, you can become a patron. Link in the description below. And see you next time.